Night shifts at the police station are often quiet and uneventful, especially in a small town where not much crime occurs. But sometimes, even in the calmest of nights, something happens that leaves a mark on the soul. Jack Harris, an experienced officer, had just started his night shift. The town was empty, and his patrol car was surrounded by silence. He was enjoying the tranquility when his radio suddenly crackled to life. "We've received a call from an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. There are reports of suspicious noises," the dispatcher's voice came through. Jack was unsure of what to expect. The abandoned factory had been out of use for years. He drove to the location and arrived at the dilapidated building. Inside, it was dark and quiet, with only the old ceiling creaking in the wind. He turned on his flashlight and ventured deeper into the building. As Jack investigated, he noticed strange footprints on the dusty floor leading to an old office. He proceeded with caution, noticing that the door to the office was slightly ajar. Jack entered and saw old documents and dusty chairs scattered around, but in the corner there was an empty animal cage. Gathering his nerves, Jack checked his radio, but it was silent. He felt a pang of fear as he approached a window to scan the surroundings. His attention was drawn to a faint light coming from the basement. Jack couldn't make out what it could be, but decided to investigate. The basement was even darker, illuminated only by a dim flicker of a single overhead bulb. As Jack descended the stairs, the cold air pressed heavily against his chest. He spotted a metal door that seemed impossible to open without special tools. On the wall next to the door, Jack saw bloody scrawls, "Help us," and "Please." His heart raced, and he cautiously opened the door. Behind it was a narrow, eerie tunnel. The noises he had heard earlier now seemed louder and clearer. They were human screams. Jack began to move through the tunnel, his flashlight illuminating only a small area ahead. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw a shadowy figure quickly disappearing. Jack chased after it, but the shadow vanished into the darkness. When he returned to the tunnel, his flashlight went out. Without light, Jack was nearly blind. Suddenly, he felt cold hands gripping his shoulders. He turned, but saw no one. At that moment, he was overwhelmed with terror. He realized he was not alone. The commotion in the tunnel continued as Jack saw figures of people bound to the walls in the distance. He tried to get closer, but his legs suddenly got caught in a trap hidden under the dust. Jack felt cold hands beginning to pull him down. Desperately trying to escape, he drew his gun and fired a shot into the ceiling. The loud noise attracted the attention of the rescuers who had arrived on his call. They freed him and the other people, but many were in shock and couldn't explain what had happened. As the rescuers tried to piece together the situation, Jack noticed that his radio was working again. Soon, he heard the familiar voice of the dispatcher. But as he began to speak, the voice became distorted and strange. It kept repeating the same words: "Don't let them go. They can't escape." Jack left the abandoned factory, but every night he was haunted by the memories of that terrifying encounter. He learned that the factory had once been the site of illegal experiments, and these experiments had left a shadow of fear within its walls. Jack and his colleagues managed to save the survivors, but the officer could never forget the eerie sounds and dark shadows that haunted him that night. Every time Jack returned for a night shift, he felt as if unseen eyes were watching him, and he could never shake the feeling that the shadows of the abandoned factory were creeping back into his consciousness. Story 2. On a lonely winter evening, as the snowy streets sank into silence, office worker Alex stayed late to finish an important project. The evening hours dragged on, and outside, under the streetlights, a thick layer of snow lay on the ground. The office, as usual, was almost empty, with the only light coming from dim desk lamps and monitors. Alex was a person who often worked late into the night, and his colleagues called him the night ghost because of his constant late hours. That evening, he was particularly absorbed in his work. Everything around him seemed silent, and the stillness was almost suffocating. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound accompanying his tapping keyboard. As he focused intently on typing data, a strange sound suddenly broke the silence, a crackling noise coming from the dark corners of the office. Alex tensed and looked around, but apart from the dripping water from an old pipe, he saw nothing unusual. Assuming it was just the usual office noises, he turned his attention back to his project. The crackling persisted. It grew louder and more insistent, as if something was trying to get his attention. Alex tried to ignore it, but the sound was becoming impossible to ignore. It was as though someone or something was moving around in the darkened corners of the office. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. Deciding to investigate, Alex stood up and headed out. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and each step seemed to hasten his unease. The cold air from the air conditioning felt unusually sharp against his skin. As he walked, he noticed that the usually bright fluorescent lights in the hallways were flickering intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When he reached the server room, where the equipment was usually stored, the door suddenly slammed shut behind him with a dull thud. Alex felt his heart race. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped through the crack. He pushed the door open and entered the room, filled with old, dusty server racks. On a dusty old desk, he noticed strange documents and folders scattered haphazardly, as well as a mysterious note. Final warning, his hands trembled as he opened a drawer and discovered an old journal and several photographs. The photographs showed people in office attire who looked like ghosts, their faces distorted and hauntingly blurry. As Alex examined the journal, he realized it was filled with cryptic entries and strange symbols. One entry stood out: "They never leave. The office keeps them." A cold chill ran through him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around the room, but it remained empty and silent. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Alex's breath quickened, and he fumbled for his phone to use its flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing unsettling patterns on the walls, symbols that seemed to writhe and move as if they had a life of their own. The crackling noise returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Panicking, Alex raced to the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, but there was no response. The sense of being trapped and watched grew overwhelming. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls seemingly bending and shifting. Desperate, Alex turned to the old journal again. He noticed another entry: "To escape, you must face the truth." But what truth? He felt a presence behind him, and as he turned, he saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. The figure was indistinct but seemed to have a form an office worker, like those in the photographs, with a face that was obscured and twisted. The figure seemed to move closer, and Alex's fear turned to terror. He stumbled backward, and the journal fell from his hands, pages scattering across the floor. The shadow reached out with an almost tangible, ghostly hand. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure whispered something indistinguishable but menacing. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered back on, and the shadowy figure vanished. Alex, trembling and gasping for breath, found himself alone in the server room. The door was now ajar, and he didn't hesitate to run. He raced through the corridors, his footsteps echoing louder than ever, and burst out into the cold night air. The next morning, when his colleagues arrived, they found the office in disarray. Papers were strewn about, and Alex's workstation was abandoned. There was no sign of Alex anywhere. His computer was on, displaying a message on the screen: "Leave now before it's too late." The office remained eerily quiet for days, and rumors began to spread about the strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear strange noises or see fleeting shadows in the corners of their eyes. Others said that Alex's disappearance was just the latest in a series of unexplained events that had plagued the office for years. To this day, the building stands as a chilling reminder of what happened that fateful night. Employees avoid staying late and avoid discussing Alex's name, fearful of attracting whatever it was that had claimed him. The shadows in the office seemed to linger a little longer, and the flickering lights cast an unsettling glow, as if the office itself is hiding something that never truly leaves. Story 3. It all started when I took a job as a night security guard at a downtown office building. It was a glass tower that looked impressive during the day but seemed almost eerie at night when it was empty. My duties included patrolling the hallways, checking locks, and monitoring the cameras, and this monotonous routine gradually became a part of my nightly calm. The hum of the building systems and the glow of the monitors became familiar. Martin, the janitor who worked the same shift, seemed off from the start. He was an older man with thinning gray hair and an unsettling way of moving silently. At first, it was just a gut feeling, but over time it grew stronger. Martin would often be in places he shouldn't be, like standing in the middle of a hallway or staring out of a window without cleaning. He would ignore me when I tried to speak to him, which made me uneasy. One night, I noticed that the security camera showed static, and then Martin would appear on the screen, standing still in a hallway I had just checked. This happened frequently, and it made me suspect that something was wrong. Small items from my desk started going missing: pens, key cards, and they would turn up in odd places like old office supply closets or unused stairwells. This heightened my anxiety, and I decided to investigate. One night when I saw Martin on the cameras in the basement, a place he had no reason to be. I decided to follow him. I took a flashlight and went downstairs, where I found a hidden door behind a metal shelf. Inside was a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness. I descended and discovered a small room filled with personal items, photographs, clothing, and disturbing things like hair, blood-stained rags, and bones. In the center was an old photograph of Martin's family. As I was trying to leave, Martin appeared in the doorway with a calm but menacing expression. He said, "You shouldn't have come down here," and I fled up the stairs, barely escaping him. I locked myself in the security office and called the police. They arrived quickly, but Martin was gone, and the room was just as I had left it. Although there was enough evidence to start an investigation, they never found him. I quit the job the next morning, but the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting, lingered. Even now, I sometimes hear the sound of footsteps echoing down empty hallways, but I'm no longer there to stop him. My experience in that building remains a haunting reminder that some things are better left unexplored and unanswered. Story 4. On a gloomy autumn night, as fog enveloped the zoo, night watchman David began his shift. The moon barely pierced through the thick clouds, and everything seemed to be shrouded in deep darkness. The wind howled, creating eerie sounds, and the old trees scattered around the zoo creaked as if something was lurking in their shadows. The zoo was closed to visitors, and an absolute silence reigned, broken only by the occasional sounds of nocturnal nature. David, bundled up in a warm jacket and carrying a flashlight, began his rounds. He had checked the surveillance cameras and security systems. Everything seemed to be in order. His job was to maintain order and ensure that nothing suspicious was happening. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Suddenly, David heard a strange noise coming from an old pavilion that had long been closed. It was an unclear crackling sound, as if someone or something was moving inside. David listened carefully, but the sounds continued, as if something in the zoo was restless. With a racing heart, he made his way toward the old pavilion, trying to be as quiet as possible. When he reached the door, he noticed that it was slightly ajar. This was odd, since the pavilion should have been securely locked. He cautiously peeked inside and saw nothing but darkness. Moving carefully, David turned on his flashlight and illuminated the room. Inside were empty display cases, old tools, and layers of dust. But in one corner, he noticed something unusual: a snake lying on a glass shelf. The snake was motionless, but its eyes were completely black, as if they had no pupils. Feeling a surge of unease, David moved closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, a strange whisper filled the silence, as if someone was calling his name. He turned around but saw no one. With a growing sense of dread, David stepped back and tried to close the door, but it slammed shut with a loud bang, and the lock seemed to be secured from the inside. Panic gripped him, and he noticed shadows starting to move across the walls of the pavilion, twisting and stretching into bizarre shapes. David began to panic, but gathering his courage, he headed towards the exit. As he moved, the shadows became more pronounced, and the whispers grew louder, turning into incoherent murmurs. In a frantic rush, he returned to the office, only to find that the surveillance cameras were off, and the monitors showed only static. The next morning, when the zoo reopened to visitors, David had vanished without a trace. Since then, there have been rumors in the zoo about strange sounds and shadows appearing during the full moon, and people claim to sometimes see a snake with black eyes writhing in the night. Story number 5. Emma and Lily, 2 young women, had recently taken on night shifts at a large IT company. Since the company operated 24, they often found themselves alone in the office during the late hours. Usually the nights were uneventful, but one particular evening would change everything. On that night, the office was unusually quiet. The city sounds outside seemed to have faded, and the monitors bathed the room in a soft blue glow. Emma and Lily were sitting at their desks, occasionally chatting and smiling. On the wall beside them hung a calendar marking the beginning of September, and the windows were closed tight. Around 1 a.m., Emma noticed that the light in one of the server cabinets at the far end of the office had gone out. It was odd because the servers were usually running without a hitch. She suggested Lily check it out, but Lily dismissed it, thinking it might be a random glitch or overheating issue. A few minutes later, Emma saw that the light in the cabinet had gone out again. Feeling uneasy, she insisted that Lily accompany her to investigate. Together, they walked to the server cabinet and, upon opening the door, saw that all the servers were still on, but one of the monitors displayed a strange, distorted image. Lily decided to reboot the server, but as soon as she touched the button, the screen briefly flickered with a haunting image. Women in old-fashioned dresses with faces twisted into grotesque grimaces. The girls shuddered but chalked it up to a software error and returned to their desks. As the night wore on, things began to get stranger. Emma noticed the office lights flickering, and the overall illumination grew dim. Periodically, she heard odd noises like rustling and footsteps coming from the empty office rooms. She convinced herself it was just her imagination and tried to focus on her work. Lily, on the other hand, saw that papers had mysteriously appeared on a desk next to hers. They were covered in indecipherable symbols and eerie drawings that seemed almost alive. When Emma and Lily came together again to discuss what was happening, they heard a strange sound in the office, a noise like something rolling across the floor. They turned to see one of the chairs slowly rolling down the corridor, though no one had touched it. In a panic, they decided to leave the office, but the doors seemed to be stuck. Emma tried using her electronic pass, but it wouldn't work. Lily, holding her phone, noticed a new message on the screen. Help US. It appeared against the backdrop of a darkened room. Meanwhile, dark figures began to manifest in the corridor, slowly approaching the women. Emma and Lily, terrified, ran to one of the office windows, but outside they only saw darkness, as if the office had been transported to an unknown place. When they finally found a way out through the emergency exit, they found themselves outside, but saw the office lights flickering again, with the silhouette of a woman in an old-fashioned dress visible in the shadows. Since that night, Emma and Lily never returned to the office. The building is said to be abandoned now, and it's rumored that anyone brave enough to enter at night might see the same eerie figures and hear the same strange sounds they did. I was delivering packages late one night, and everything was going as usual until I reached a desolate industrial park. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem amplified. As I approached the warehouse for my drop-off, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. He was unnaturally stiff, almost as if he were waiting for something, and despite my calls, he remained motionless. The sight was unsettling enough to make my heart race. As I moved closer, the figure vanished into thin air. I was left disoriented and unnerved. Shaken, I quickly dropped off the package and hurried back to my van. My hands were trembling as I started the engine and sped away. Every subsequent stop on my route felt tense, as if the figure's eerie presence was lingering. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. My last delivery of the night was at an old, seemingly abandoned office building at the edge of the industrial park. The place looked decrepit, with grime-covered windows and no signs of recent activity. The address matched the package, so I approached, bracing myself against the biting cold. As I neared the building, a piece of paper taped to the glass caught my eye. It was hastily scrawled in red marker, "Leave now. You're being watched." A shiver ran down my spine. Was this a prank or something more sinister? I thought back to the figure at the warehouse and felt a wave of dread. The silence around me felt suffocating. I dropped the package at the door and turned to leave, but a soft rustling sound stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned around slowly and saw the figure once again, standing in the shadows near the corner of the building. His features were obscured, but the same unnerving stillness was present. Panic surged through me, and I ran back to the van, fumbling with the keys. My hands were so shaky that I almost couldn't get the door open. When I finally managed to get inside, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze piercing through the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas pedal, swerving around him. My headlights caught a brief glimpse of his figure as I sped past, but when I looked back in the rearview mirror, he had vanished. I drove out of the industrial park as quickly as possible, my grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. I kept checking the mirrors, but the road behind me was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away on the highway, my heart still pounding. My mind raced with questions. Who was that figure? Why was he following me? And what did the note mean? I tried to convince myself it was all a prank or a series of coincidences, but the feeling that I had crossed into a place I wasn't supposed to be persisted. When I returned to the warehouse to drop off the van, I was still on edge. The dispatcher gave me a strange look as I handed him my keys. He opened his mouth, as if about to say something, but then hesitated and simply handed me my receipt. I asked if everything was okay, trying to sound nonchalant. He replied with a nod, though he looked uneasy. "It's just strange," he said. Another driver reported seeing someone hanging around the industrial park last week. Said it creeped him out. My stomach dropped. "Did they say what he looked like?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, just that he felt like he was being followed." I didn't say anything more. I left the warehouse and haven't been back since. I told him I was sick, but the truth is, I'm terrified. Terrified that if I return, I'll see the figure again. That night has left me with a lingering fear that I can't shake, a feeling that I'm still being watched even though I'm far away from that industrial park.